I came home from a 12-hour hospital shift, hoping for a quiet evening and maybe a beer on the porch. Instead, I found a big, greasy oil stain where my truck used to be. My driveway, that's where I parked it every day. Gone. I immediately thought it was stolen. I mean, who steals an old Silverado with a cracked windshield and a toolbox welded to the bed? I was halfway to calling the cops when my neighbor, Greg, waved me down. "Hey, Adrian," he called, jogging over. "You didn't see it. The tow truck was here around noon." Karren from the HOA flagged them down. "Wait, what?" I said, feeling my blood pressure spike. "Karren did what?" Greg nodded. "Said something about your truck violating the aesthetic policy, called it an eyesore." That woman. Karren Whitmore. President of the HOA, queen of passive-aggressive emails and self-appointed neighborhood watchdog. She once fined a guy for having a basketball hoop visible from the street. I should have known she'd find a new target. I didn't waste time. I called the tow company. After 3 different transfers and a 20-minute hold, I got a bored-sounding guy who confirmed it. "Yeah, white Silverado, plate 7XG, yeah, we towed it." Guy said it was an HOA violation. "That's my driveway," I said. "It's private property." "Take it up with the HOA man." "We just get the call." I hung up and drove down there in my wife's car. Turns out they towed it to a lot 20 minutes away and already charged over $300. I paid it, furious, and drove the truck back home, still in my scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and sweat. When I pulled into my driveway, Karren was already there. Arms crossed, wearing one of her signature floral blouses, and that look like she's trying to summon the police with her eyes. "You're not allowed to park that thing here," she said, pointing like she was casting a spell. I got out and stared at her. "You towed my truck from my own driveway. It violates HOA appearance standards," she snapped. "It's rusty. It lowers property value. You have zero authority to tow from private property. That's what the street is for." "You committed theft." "It's well within our rights," she said. "And if you don't move it, we'll do it again." That's when I pulled out my phone. "Cool. I just wanted to make sure I got that on camera. I already called the police." Her eyes twitched slightly. "They won't do anything." "We're the HOA." "Yeah," I said, "and you're about to find out that doesn't mean what you think it does." 5 minutes later, a cruiser pulled up. Officer Ruiz stepped out, took one look at Karren, then at me, and sighed. "She tow that from your driveway?" he asked. "Sure did," I said. Karren stepped forward. "Officer, we have a community standard to uphold. That vehicle is in violation." Ruiz held up his hand. "Ma'am, did you authorize a tow from his property?" "We're the HOA," she said again, like that was some magic phrase. "That's not a yes," Ruiz said. "Because if you did, that's illegal. You can't remove someone's property from their own land." Karren opened her mouth, then closed it. "I'll need you to sit tight," Ruiz said. "Dispatch is sending someone over to take a statement." I could have kissed the man. Instead, I leaned on my truck and crossed my arms, watching Karren pace like a caged poodle. Her empire just cracked, and I wasn't done yet. HOA story HOA stories Homeowners Association stories Ruiz was still on his radio when the second cruiser rolled up. This time, it wasn't just another patrol officer, it was a plainclothes detective in a tan blazer, badge clipped to his belt. He stepped out with a clipboard in one hand and a look that said he'd rather be anywhere else, but knew this was serious. He nodded to Ruiz, who gestured toward me. "Mr. Morneau, right?" the detective asked. I nodded. "That's me. I'm Detective Heller. We've got a report here about unauthorized towing from private property. You're the registered owner of the vehicle." I handed him my title and insurance. He glanced them over, then looked toward Karren, who was now pacing a few feet away, pretending to be on a call but clearly listening. "Let me guess," he said under his breath. "HOA president thinks she's City Hall." "You guessed it." He motioned me off to the side. "All right. Walk me through everything. Start from the moment you noticed the truck was gone." I laid it out for him coming home, Greg's heads up, the call to the tow company, everything. I showed him the receipt from the impound lot and the time-stamped video of Karren confronting me when I returned. Heller's eyebrows twitched once when I played the part where she admitted she'd have it towed again. "That's helpful," he said. "Real helpful." He walked back toward Ruiz, pulling him aside and speaking low. Meanwhile, Karren finally approached me again, arms still folded but her tone more cautious now. "I hope you understand," she began. "This isn't personal, it's about protecting the neighborhood standard." I didn't look at her. "You're in over your head," her voice tightened. "We have the right to maintain appearances. This community was built on order." I turned to face her. "You stepped onto my property without notice. You called a private towing company and had them remove my vehicle without even contacting me. Then you tried to justify it in front of a police officer. That's not order, Karren. That's criminal trespass and unauthorized removal of property. You don't get to rewrite the law because a truck offends your sensibilities." Her mouth opened, but she was interrupted by Heller stepping back over. "Ma'am," he said to her, flipping a page on his clipboard, "I need a formal statement, and you should know. We've pulled the HOA charter and bylaws for this neighborhood. There's no clause in there granting towing authority from private driveways, which means you overstepped." "Big time." "I acted in the community's best interest," she said, standing straighter. "Thing is," Heller said, "intent doesn't change the law. You authorized a third-party contractor to enter private residential property and remove personal property. That's a Class B misdemeanor under state code. Possibly more, depending on how this plays out," she blinked. "You're charging me," he didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to me. "Mr. Morneau, would you like to press charges?" I didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." Heller scribbled something, then handed Karren a small white slip. "This is a citation for unlawful vehicle towing. You'll be contacted by the city attorney's office. You're also liable for the impound fees." She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon dipped in vinegar. "You can't be serious." "We're past serious," he replied. "You're lucky we're stopping at a citation unless more comes up in the investigation." That's when Greg, who'd been standing behind his hedge trying not to look like he was watching, stepped forward. "Detective," he said, "I've got a ring cam." It caught the whole thing, the tow truck, Karren directing it, even her telling the driver to make it quick. "Want a copy?" Heller looked back at me, then at Karren. "Yeah, I do," she turned to Greg sharply. "That footage is private." "Nope," he said, shaking his head. "My property, my cam." "And the sidewalk's public domain. You walked right into frame." Karren's facade started to crack. Her voice got higher, thinner. "You're all ganging up on me." I stepped forward. "No, Karren, we're holding you accountable." She spun without saying another word and stalked off toward her house. Heller watched her go, then turned to Ruiz. "Let's get statements from the tow company next. I want to know who gave them the green light to show up without verifying ownership." Ruiz nodded and headed back to his cruiser. Heller lingered a moment longer. "You said she's towed before," he asked me. "Not from private property, far as I know, but she's issued fake notices, fines that don't match the bylaws. I've got a folder." "Send it to me," he said. "If there's a pattern, we're not just talking about one bad call, we're talking abuse of authority. Maybe even criminal impersonation if she used city-style forms." He handed me a card. "Email it here, and if she threatens you again, call me directly." I watched him leave, then turned to Greg, who looked both amused and stunned. "Guess she's not untouchable after all," he said. "Nope," I muttered. "She just thought no one would push back." That night I didn't sleep much, not because I was anxious. Because once I started digging through my emails, I found more than I expected: letters from Karren on official-looking letterhead, fines that didn't match the HOA's published fee schedule, and even one where she demanded a neighbor remove a bird bath because it attracted pests. I started scanning everything. By morning, I had a 16-page PDF with dates, screenshots, and digital copies of every overreach she'd committed in the past 2 years. I added a note at the top: "Pattern of extralegal enforcement by HOA President Karren Whitmore," and sent it to Heller. 2 days later, I got a follow-up. The city attorney was reviewing the case, and they weren't just looking at the towing. They were investigating whether Karren had been impersonating municipal code enforcement. Turns out, some of the forms she'd used were nearly identical to ones used by the actual city inspectors down to the fonts and seal placement. It got worse for her. The tow company, when questioned, revealed that Karren had signed a document claiming to represent a municipal board. Not the HOA, a government board. That bumped the whole thing into felony territory: forgery, misrepresentation, illegal seizure of private property. Within a week, Karren was served with a court summons. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, which she didn't attend. Half the neighborhood showed up. Greg and I included. I read a short statement, nothing dramatic, just the facts. She overstepped, I said. She broke the law and she used our HOA to do it. Someone clapped, then someone else. Then it turned into full-on applause. By the end of the night, a motion was on the table to suspend her pending a formal vote. The motion passed. Unanimously, as I walked home, Greg jogged up beside me. "You know," he said, "I think she really believed no one would ever call her out." "That's usually how people like her operate," I said, "until someone holds up a mirror." He nodded. "So what now?" I looked around. For the first time in a while, the neighborhood felt lighter, less tense. "Now," I said, "we fix it." The morning after Karren was suspended, a city vehicle rolled down our street and parked in front of her house. A woman with a clipboard and a badge identifying her as a municipal compliance investigator stepped out. She didn't knock. She walked the perimeter of the property, took photos, then crossed the street and began inspecting the HOA bulletin board posted near the entrance to the neighborhood. I watched from my porch, sipping coffee. Greg wandered over, holding his own mug. "She's not here for a social call," he said. "Nope," I said. "Looks like the city's pulling threads." By noon, 3 more cars had shown up. One was from the city attorney's office. Another had plates registered to the county recorder. The third belonged to a uniformed officer I hadn't seen before, who introduced himself to the investigator and handed her a sealed manila envelope. The whole thing had the feel of a quiet storm gathering force. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Detective Heller. He asked if I was free to come down to City Hall the next morning. He said he wanted to loop me in on something. His tone didn't give anything away, but I could tell it was important. When I arrived, Heller met me in the lobby and led me to a small conference room. The municipal investigator from the previous day was already seated, along with a woman in a sharp navy suit who introduced herself as Assistant City Attorney Lavelle. Heller opened a folder and spread out several documents. "So," he said, "this just got a lot bigger." Lavelle slid a page toward me. "Your HOA president has been submitting falsified reports to the city for over a year. She's been forging city inspection citations in order to pressure homeowners into compliance. We found at least 17 cases where she used an altered version of the city's code enforcement forms." The investigator interjected. "Some of these included threats of liens, which she had no authority to issue. We believe she printed the forms herself, added real municipal logos, and copied the language directly from actual city notices." Lavelle leaned forward. "That's not just unethical, that's a felony." I looked over the documents. Some had addresses I recognized, neighbors who'd mentioned oddly aggressive warnings, but had never gone public with them. Heller continued. "We also pulled her communications with the tow company. She created a fake authorization letter claiming she was acting on behalf of the Department of Neighborhood Maintenance. That department doesn't even exist. She made it up." Lavelle nodded. "That sealed it. We're filing formal charges: fraudulent impersonation of a public official, illegal seizure of property, and abuse of position." I took a breath. "So what happens now?" "She's being arrested this week," Lavelle said. "Quietly but formally, no early warnings. We're also issuing subpoenas for HOA board meeting minutes and financial records. If she's misused funds or issued non-approved fines, we'll fine that too." The investigator added, "We'd appreciate if you didn't mention this publicly until the arrest is made." I agreed. On the way out, Heller pulled me aside and handed me a flash drive. We compiled a full copy of everything submitted so far, not just for the case, this is for you and your neighbors. If you want to call a special meeting and inform the community, this will help. That night, I called Greg and a few other residents I trusted. We held an informal gathering at my place, no announcements, just word of mouth. By 8, 15 people were seated in my backyard, most with questions and all of them looking uneasy. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop and projected it onto a sheet I'd hung across the fence. One by one, I walked them through the forms, the forged documents, and the charges pending against Karren. No one interrupted. Faces shifted from confusion to anger to disbelief. When it was over, a soft-spoken man named Elliot, he lived 3 houses down and rarely spoke at meetings, raised his hand. "She fined me last year for a tool shed," he said. "Said it was a fire hazard. I paid it because she said the city would come after me if I didn't." "She threatened me with a lien over a broken gate," another neighbor added. "Said the city inspector had already flagged it." "I never saw any paperwork," I nodded. "That's because the paperwork wasn't from the city, she made it all up." A woman named Denise, who'd lived there since the subdivision was built, stood up slowly. "I've kept every letter she ever sent me. I thought she was just overzealous." I didn't realize she was lying about who she represented. I looked around. The city's taking action, but we've got a job to do too. We can't let someone else with the same mindset fill her spot. We need a board that answers to us, not the other way around. Greg spoke up. "We vote in 2 weeks. Let's make it count." The next morning, Karren was arrested in her driveway. A pair of unmarked sedans pulled up quietly just after sunrise. She stepped out in a robe and slippers, clearly just grabbing the morning paper when the officers approached. One read her the charges aloud. She didn't shout, didn't resist. She just stood there, frozen, as the cuffs were clicked into place. I didn't watch it happen. I didn't have to. Half the neighborhood saw it from behind curtains or through blinds. By noon, the news had reached every household without a single social media post or newsletter. That same day, the rest of the HOA board announced a full emergency audit. The treasurer, a slim man named Robert who'd never looked comfortable during meetings, resigned by afternoon. Turns out, Karren had been approving fines and issuing them without board votes for months. In some cases, she'd inflated the amounts and deposited the payments directly into a second, unauthorized account labeled Administrative Discretionary Fund. The audit found over $23,000 in misappropriated funds. The city froze the HOA's general account until new officers could be elected. Lavelle's office filed additional charges, this time for embezzlement and financial misconduct. Neighbors began organizing. Elliot printed copies of the bylaws and began hosting reading sessions at his house. Denise created a shared drive with every official HOA form, so no one could be misled again. Greg and I helped draft a new amendment. Any board action involving resident property needed written approval from 2/3 of board members, and a public notice posted 72 hours in advance. 3 weeks later, the election was held under city oversight. Every board seat was up for grabs. Greg was voted president. Denise became treasurer. Elliot took the secretary role. I declined a formal position but agreed to serve as an advisor to the compliance committee. The unauthorized fines were voided. Victims were reimbursed. The fake documents were archived for legal reference. At the first official board meeting under the new leadership, Greg stood in front of the crowd, over 70 residents packed into the community center, and held up a printed copy of the new transparency policy. "This," he said, "is how we make sure no one ever uses fear to control this neighborhood again." The room erupted in applause. As I stood near the back, arms folded, someone tapped my shoulder. It was the municipal investigator. "Just wanted to say," she said, "you set this in motion." Most people would have just paid the fine and grumbled. "You changed things." I didn't have much to say to that. I just nodded because she was right. It started with a stolen truck, but it ended with a neighborhood reclaiming its voice. And Karren learning too late that, when you act like you're above the law, the fall is a long one. It had been nearly 2 months since the arrest. The neighborhood still bore the scars of Karren's reign. A few dead flower beds from forced removals, paint mismatches from unnecessary citations, and a general tension that still hung in the air like the aftertaste of something bitter. But things were changing. The new board held consistent meetings transparent, open to residents, recorded and posted online. The community center, once used for Karren's staged town halls, now welcomed real voices. People brought folding chairs and opinions. Even the teenagers who used to sneak out behind the creek trail started volunteering to repaint signs and clean up the park. But the wider fallout from Karren's actions hadn't stopped. Not by a long shot. One Tuesday morning, I received a knock at the door. It was Detective Heller again, holding a thick folder and looking more serious than usual. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside and offered him a seat at the kitchen table. He didn't waste time. "We found something else," he said, opening the folder. "It's bigger." He slid over a series of printed emails. Each was between Karren and a man whose name I didn't recognize, Douglas T. Crane. His email domain was from a property management firm based 2 counties over. "She was working with a developer," I asked. "Not just working," Heller said. "She had a side agreement." He pulled out a spreadsheet. "She promised Crane early access to properties flagged for chronic violations, along with recommendations to the board to push those homeowners into selling. In exchange, he wired her monthly payments disguised as consulting fees." I leaned forward. "You're saying she was deliberately targeting homeowners to drive them out?" Heller nodded. "We've confirmed at least 6 instances, all elderly residents. 3 sold below market value after months of harassment. 2 others entered arbitration with the HOA and signed over sale rights. One is still in her home, but she's been hospitalized twice stress-related." I shook my head. "She was engineering removals to hand off properties to a developer and profiting from it," Heller said. "We tracked over $35,000 in deposits to a separate account she didn't disclose to the IRS. We've already notified the county prosecutor. Charges are being expanded." I stood and walked to the window. Across the street, Mrs. Langford's shutters were still closed. She hadn't come outside since her fall last month. "She targeted Mrs. Langford," I said quietly. "She did," Heller confirmed. "And we're going to make sure the court knows it." I turned back to him. "What do you need from me?" Heller pulled out a smaller envelope. "You're listed as a witness for the civil suit, but there's something else too. The board asked us to deliver this." He handed me a formal notice. It was an invitation to testify at the upcoming HOA General Assembly. They were holding a full accountability forum. Not just a summary of the case, but an open session where residents could speak, present evidence, and vote on permanent policy amendments. I attended not because I needed closure, but because too many people still didn't know how deep it had gone. That evening, the community center was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls. A projector displayed a timeline of events. Greg stood at the podium, his voice steady even as the room buzzed with tension. "We're here to do more than talk," he said. "We're here to make sure this never happens again." I was called up midway through. I brought photos, timestamps, and statements from affected neighbors. I showed how Karren's forged violations often followed a pattern targeting those who lived alone, those who didn't attend meetings, those least likely to fight back. Denise spoke next, revealing the board's audit findings. Karren had also been siphoning vendor kickbacks from landscaping and maintenance contracts negotiated without board approval. More than a dozen community upgrades had been delayed or canceled while she funneled money into her personal account. Then came the final blow. The city's assistant attorney, Lavelle, had agreed to appear in person. She took the floor in a tailored gray suit, her voice calm but firm. "Let me be clear," she began. "This was not a case of poor management. This was criminal exploitation under the guise of community stewardship. Karren Whitmore used her position to create a system of coercion, financial manipulation, and property displacement. And it wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. She laid out the formal charges: 8 counts of fraudulent impersonation, 5 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of elder intimidation, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. She will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, Lavelle concluded. The assembly remained silent for a moment. Then a slow, deliberate round of applause began. It wasn't celebratory, it was a release. A recognition that something rotten had been excised. Greg stepped back up. It's time to ratify the charter amendments. The changes passed unanimously. No board member could hold more than 1 term without a supermajority vote. All board correspondence had to be archived and made available to residents within 72 hours. And most importantly, any enforcement action against a resident now required a public hearing with the right to appeal. As the meeting adjourned, people lingered. Some hugged. A few just sat quietly, no one left in a hurry. Outside, the night was cool. Greg walked beside me in the parking lot. "Feels like we're finally turning the page," he said. "We are," I replied. "But we don't forget the last chapter," he nodded. "You think she'll do time?" "Lavelle doesn't bluff," I said. "And she's got a stack of evidence taller than my truck." "Speaking of which," he said, grinning slightly, "you still parking that thing in the driveway?" "Every day," I said. "And now it's got a steel-posted private property sign next to it. Just in case someone gets bold again." 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the city. Karren Whitmore had accepted a plea deal. She confessed to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, 18 months in state prison, 5 years probation, and a permanent ban from holding any leadership position in a registered HOA or nonprofit. She was also ordered to pay restitution. The seized funds, just under $42,000, were being returned to the HOA's reserve account to be used for community repairs and elderly assistance programs. The board voted to name the new Community Resource Fund after Mrs. Langford, who had returned home and was now receiving weekly check-ins from volunteers. One afternoon, I dropped off a box of groceries at her porch. She opened the door slowly, leaning on her walker. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Maybe not," I replied. "But I wanted to." She looked at me, eyes soft. "You know, when this place was built, we thought it would be quiet, peaceful, but it's never been stronger than it is right now." I nodded. "Sometimes it takes a storm to show us what holds." She smiled, then tapped the side of the porch with her cane. "You park that truck right there, right where the sun hits it. Remind folks it's your home." That evening, I did just that. I pulled into the driveway, locked up, and stood for a moment, watching the light catch on the hood. Somewhere in the distance, kids were playing and laughter drifted on the breeze. No more forged notices. No more threats. Just a neighborhood that learned how to fight back and how to stand together.